Hello everybody. Some time back, Hamza Tzortzis decided he was an expert on consciousness. I released 2 videos analysing his 2 appearances on the Thought Adventure podcast, demonstrating that he is no such expert. In January 2023, Hamza Tzortzis, on the topic of consciousness, went full Dunning-Kruger and released a video criticising Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is an American neuroscientist and associate professor in neurobiology and psychiatry and behavioral sciences. In this video, I will analyse the claims made in that video. His first criticism is that Dr. Huberman assumes physicalism. This is the metaphysical thesis that everything is physical. He shares a clip where Dr. Huberman says that he does not distinguish between the brain and the mind and that the two are interchangeable. He then goes into his argument, but first of all I will allow him to define qualia, which will feature in the video.
A key aspect of the mind includes inner subjective conscious experience, and in the language of neuroscience, this is referred to as qualia. And this also includes the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness, which we're going to unpack, cannot be answered by neurobiological investigation.
This is the first mention of the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problem of consciousness is understanding what our brains are doing when we have various conscious experiences. For example, eating an ice cream can be demonstrated objectively through the firing of taste receptors, which leads up to the brain, which then integrates this information, and subjects are able to verbalize the phenomena of eating an ice cream. The hard problem asks why and how humans have these experiences, which are called qualia, as a result of these physical processes. So to use this example of eating an ice cream, the easy problem would be mapping the brain activity from the taste receptors into the tongue up into the brain, but the hard problem would be explaining why a person has a sense of delight as they are enjoying the ice cream. Another example is in the so-called fight or flight response. When we perceive a threat, our body reacts, releasing hormones and activating the nervous system. In the brain, this causes the limbic system to become more active. This is the easy problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness, in this example, would be why seeing the threatening event would cause us to have the inner subjective experience of fear. Hamza Tzortzis says that the hard problem of consciousness cannot be answered by neurobiological investigation. Let's see if he can back up that assertion.
Popular scientists or academics, just like Dr. Huberman, provide a great service to their viewers and followers. However, their popularity may blind people to the false philosophical assumptions that may promote an atheistic or materialistic discourse. So in the context of today's video, the main key objective is to show that Huberman's assertion that the mind and the brain are the same, which is held by many neuroscientists and atheists, is based on the false assumption that neuroscience can fully and adequately explain the mind and the brain.
And now we are starting to see a bit of an agenda here. Hamza Tzortzis is worried that a physicalist approach to the brain, where there is no need to posit a soul, may lead people to atheism. He describes this as a false philosophical assumption. Neuroscience may not be fully and adequately able to explain the mind and the brain at the moment, but we cannot say that it will never be able to do this in the future. To make such a claim is an assertion for which you need to provide evidence.
However, neuroscience is based on the philosophical assumption known as physicalism.
Neuroscience does not begin with the assumption of physicalism. It is a science. It looks to explain phenomena. Firstly, there has to be a way of demonstrating a non-physical entity of the brain that can be tested and incorporated into scientific theories. An alternative to physicalism is mind-body dualism, which denotes that mental phenomena are non-physical or that the mind and body are distinct and separate. In current times, neuroscientists and philosophers have favoured physicalism. Most experiences that have been thought to be the property of a mind have later been found to be correlated to the brain. We have no evidence of any consciousness existing outside of the brain.
So let's explain why Huberman seems to commit the error in reasoning, the logical fallacy known as the correlation causation fallacy. Now, it is well established that if you do anything to the brain, it's going to affect your consciousness. No one is denying this. Now, neuroscience, as a domain of knowledge, is essentially, generally speaking, a science of correlations. It's the study of correlations. They investigate neurobiological activity and they correlate it to states of consciousness and behavior. Now, this doesn't mean the brain is the same thing as consciousness.
The brain is the physical mass. Consciousness is a function of the brain. I assume you meant to say the brain and the mind are not the same thing.
So just to reiterate, no one is denying that the physical brain and consciousness are related or connected in some way, but it's just a relationship. The brain and consciousness are not necessarily the same thing. And take the following analogy into consideration. Take, for example, the car and the driver.
He then tries to give an analogy of a car and a driver, with the car being the brain and the driver as the consciousness. This is a bad analogy for many reasons. We know that a car and a driver can exist separately. The driver can walk away from the car and it's obvious they will be separate entities. This does not work for the brain and consciousness, as it has not been demonstrated that the brain and consciousness are separate entities. Evidence points to consciousness being an emergent property of a functioning brain. For example, look at the way an anesthetic causes somebody to rapidly lose consciousness, which then wears off once the anesthetic is removed.
So let's now talk about the brain and the mind. So Huberman asserts that the brain and the mind are the same thing and they can be used interchangeably. Now, what he's ignoring here, or he's not bringing to the table, is the mind with regards to inner subjective conscious experiences. And inner subjective conscious experiences is also related to this concept known as the hard problem of consciousness.
Or maybe, given Huberman's experience, he has considered inner subjective experiences and the hard problem of consciousness, and has decided that this doesn't necessitate mind-body dualism. Other philosophers and cognitive neuroscientists dispute the existence of the hard problem of consciousness.
So the hard problem of consciousness presents two key questions. Number one, what is it like for a particular organism or a human being to have an inner subjective conscious experience? And number two, why and how do these inner subjective conscious experiences arise from seemingly cold, blind, non-conscious physical processes? We can also ask, how does Hamza have an inner subjective conscious experience from having a hot chocolate on a Sunday morning? And that experience, that subjectivity, that inner subjective conscious experience arises from cold, non-conscious physical processes. How and why does that happen?
This is starting to sound like the argument from personal incredulity. Hamza Tzortzis just can't see how something like consciousness could arrive from physical matter. To help clarify this, let's look at an atom. This is a hydrogen atom. It is the simplest atom, consisting of one proton and one electron. All elements are composed of atoms containing protons, electrons and neutrons, yet they exist as gases, liquids and solids with a huge variety of properties, especially when combined with each other. Everything that we see is composed of elements which are composed of atoms.
Because if you think about physicalism as an approach to the philosophy of the mind, physicalism doesn't say that physical processes are conscious. Because if you study physicalism, physical processes and physical stuff are blind and non-conscious, meaning there is no intentional force directing these physical processes anywhere. And these physical processes are not aware of themselves or aware of anything outside of themselves, and they're not about or of something. In other words, they don't have intentionality. So how can inner subjective conscious experience, which seems to have some kind of intentional force, seems to have some form of aboutness, right? Our conscious experience is about something or of something. How can that arise from physical processes that are blind and cold, non-conscious, and they don't have any intentionality? They're not about or of something.
This is the argument from personal incredulity, but is also committing the fallacy of composition. He cannot see how something that gives rise to consciousness and inner subjective feelings with intentionality be derived from physical matter. The solution lies in emergent properties, where the whole possesses properties that are not present in any of the parts. A more simple analogy is to look at hydrogen and oxygen, which are both gases, but when combined form water, which has a dramatic difference with respect to properties.
Now, before I provide some general arguments why physicalism is false, let's explain again why neuroscience on its own fails to actually understand the mind with regards to the hard problem of consciousness. Now remember, neuroscience is mainly a study of correlations. But these correlations cannot tell us what it's like for a particular conscious organism or a person to have a specific inner subjective conscious experience. Remember, if we were to map out all the neurochemistry in the brain, all the neurochemical firings, all the neurobiological activity, it will not follow that we know what that particular person is experiencing, what that particular person's inner subjective conscious state is, and what it's like to be in that state.
This is something that you repeat ad nauseum, but you do not explain the evidence for this. We are nowhere near to fully mapping out every connection in the brain, so how can you leap to that conclusion?
To claim that inner subjective conscious experiences arise from blind, non-conscious physical stuff or physical processes or physical phenomena is like saying if someone picks up a cold, lifeless stone and rubs it for half an hour, you're going to have butterflies emerging. But we know from a cold, lifeless, non-conscious stone, you're not going to have butterflies emerging no matter how much you rub it.
I left this analogy in because it demonstrates really well how clueless he is with regards to emergent properties. Nobody ever said rubbing a stone will cause butterflies to emerge from it. To better understand emergent properties, look at the example I gave earlier with the elements being made of atoms and how hydrogen and oxygen combined to form water with different properties to their gases.
So here's a smackdown argument concerning Dr. Huberman's physicalist assumption. Number one, neuroscience assumes physicalism to be true.
Not all scientists assume physicalism to be true, though most do. Those that hold on to a dualist opinion often do so for theological reasons, but even if not, none of them have demonstrated a mechanism for a non-physical process.
Number two, physicalism cannot address the hard problem of consciousness.
It hasn't yet, but we do not know if that will remain the case in the future.
Number three, therefore, neuroscience cannot address the hard problem of consciousness. Therefore, you cannot say the brain and the mind are the same thing just because you claim to understand the brain.
It can't be said with certainty that the brain and the mind are interchangeable, but a scientist could say that this is what they consider to be the most likely case, looking at all the available evidence. The rest of this video is just repetition and summing up. There is further mention of the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we never solve the hard problem of consciousness, even if we are never able to explain inner subjective feelings, that does not mean physicalism is wrong, and it does not mean that there is a soul or a spirit which is distinct from the brain or its emergent properties. I would like to give my own opinion as to why Hamza Tzortzis has an interest in consciousness and in trying to convince people against physicalism. It was mentioned earlier in this video that he was worried that adopting a physicalist approach may lead people towards atheism. It is Hamza Tzortzis who has the false assumption of dualism for theological reasons. He needs to convince people that there is a soul or spirit which lives on after death. This is essential to believing in a religion. If people don't believe in a soul, they won't believe in an afterlife and won't follow a religion. It is for this reason that consciousness is the new battleground. Thank you for watching, and please let me know what you think in the comments section.